June 28, 2024, the day Venezuela slipped off the front page. That was the day Nicolas Maduro's government quietly announced it had seized control of a gold mine in Bolivar State, one of the largest in the Western Hemisphere, previously operated by a Canadian firm. The move didn't make the New York Times front page. It didn't even trend on Twitter. But in the backrooms of the Pentagon, the State Department, and the Kremlin, strategists I've spoken to over the past week, people who don't scare easily, are suddenly very, very concerned. I've been tracking Venezuela for over 2 decades, ever since Hugo Chavez first began his slow-motion dismantling of the country's institutions. Back then, the warnings were dismissed as alarmist. Venezuela isn't Cuba, they said. It's too rich, too connected, too democratic to collapse. Well, here we are. The country is a failed state in all but name, its economy a hollowed-out shell, its people fleeing by the millions. And yet, what's happening now isn't just another chapter in Venezuela's tragedy, it's the opening act of something far more dangerous. The problem isn't just that Venezuela is collapsing. The problem is how it's collapsing and who's stepping in to pick up the pieces. Let me tell you what the headlines aren't saying. The official A manageable crisis. If you've been following the news, here's what you've been: Venezuela is a basket case, yes, but a containable one. The US has imposed sanctions, the opposition has a legitimate claim to power, and Maduro is a weakened dictator clinging to power through repression and Russian and Chinese support. The crisis is humanitarian, but not strategic. The US has bigger fish to fry: Ukraine, Taiwan, the Middle East, and Venezuela is a distraction, a problem to be managed, not solved. The data seems to support this. The IMF estimates Venezuela's GDP has contracted by 75% since 2013. Inflation, though no longer in the millions of percent, is still running at over 200% annually. Oil production, once the lifeblood of the economy, has plummeted from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to barely 700,000 today. The U.S. has recognized Juan Guaido as interim president since 2019, and while his star has faded, the Biden administration has kept the pressure on Maduro with targeted sanctions, including a ban on Venezuelan oil imports. The media narrative is one of slow-motion decay. The Washington Post ran a piece last month titled "Venezuela's Opposition Fractures as Maduro Tightens Grip." The Economist called it a dictatorship without end. Even the more hawkish outlets, like the Wall Street Journal, have shifted their focus to the border crisis, framing Venezuela's collapse as a migration problem, not a geopolitical one. But here's the problem with this: it's dangerously incomplete. What they're not telling: the hidden stakes. Let's start with the most obvious: Venezuela isn't just poor, it's resource-rich in ways that matter far more than oil. Yes, Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves. But in the 21st century, oil is no longer the only game in town. What Maduro controls now is something far more: the largest known reserves of coltan, rare earth minerals, and gold in the Western Hemisphere. Coltan, short for columbite tantalite, is essential for smartphones, laptops, and, most critically, military-grade electronics and missile guidance systems. The U.S. Defense Logistics Agency lists tantalum as a strategic and critical material. Venezuela's coltan reserves are estimated at over 100,000 tons, second only to the Democratic Republic of Congo. And unlike the DRC, where mining is chaotic and dominated by warlords, Venezuela's deposits are concentrated in a single, governable, the Orinoco mining arc. Then there's gold. Venezuela's gold reserves were once held in the Bank of England, but in 2019, Maduro ordered them repatriated. The Bank of England refused, citing sanctions. So Maduro did something: he sold the gold to Russia and Turkey instead. Today, Venezuela's central bank holds less than 100 tons of gold, down from over 300 tons in 2018. Where did the rest go? Into the hands of Moscow and Ankara, who have been quietly stockpiling it as a hedge against Western sanctions. And rare earth minerals? The U.S. Geological Survey has identified Venezuela as having significant deposits of neodymium, dysprosium, and other elements critical for electric vehicles, wind turbines, and advanced weaponry. The U.S. currently imports 80% of its rare earths from China. Venezuela could be an alternative, but only if someone controls it. Now, here's where it gets interesting.
Maduro isn't just sitting on these resources, he's auctioning them off.
In 2023, Venezuela signed a $3.2 billion deal with a Chinese consortium to develop the Las Cristinas gold mine, one of the largest untapped deposits in the world. In 2024, Rosneft, the Russian state oil giant, secured a 20-year lease on Venezuela's offshore gas fields. And just last month, a little-noticed agreement was signed between Venezuela's state mining company and a shadowy Emirati firm linked to the UAE's sovereign wealth fund, giving Abu Dhabi access to Venezuela's coltan in exchange for infrastructure investment.
This isn't just corruption. This is a fire sale of strategic assets to America's adversaries. And the US? It's watching. But it's not acting.
The geopolitical how Venezuela became a proxy war.
Let's out.
Venezuela isn't an isolated crisis, it's a battleground in the new Cold War. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, the US has operated under the assumption that it could shape the world in its image.
Democracy promotion, regime change, economic sanctions, these were the tools of American hegemony.
But in the last decade, two things have.
1. Russia and China have stopped playing by America's rules.
2. The US is no longer the sole superpower. Venezuela is where these two trends collide. Russia's the military foothold. In 2019, Russia sent 100 military advisors to Venezuela, along with two nuclear-capable Tu-160 bombers for a training exercise.
In 2020, it deployed the Admiral Gorshkov, a frigate armed with hypersonic missiles, to Venezuelan waters.
In 2023, it signed a deal to modernize Venezuela's aging Su-30 fighter jets.
Why?
Because Venezuela is the only country in the Western Hemisphere where Russia has a permanent military presence.
Cuba is too small.
Nicaragua is too unstable. Venezuela, with its deep-water ports and proximity to the AMA Canal, is the perfect staging ground for Russian power projection in the Americas.
And it's not just about bases. Russia has weaponized Venezuela's debt.
Caracas owes Moscow over $10 billion, most of it from arms deals and oil for loans agreements. In 2022, Russia restructured the debt, extending repayment deadlines in exchange for long-term access to Venezuela's oil and mining sectors. This is how modern great power competition, not with invasions, but with economic coercion and strategic partnerships.
China's the economic colony. China doesn't need military bases in Venezuela, it has something a captive market.
Since 2007, China has loaned Venezuela over $60 billion, most of it repaid in oil.
But as Venezuela's oil production collapsed, Beijing got creative.
In 2021, China and Venezuela signed a 25-year strategic partnership agreement, giving Chinese firms preferential access to Venezuela's mining sector. In 2023, China's state-owned Sinohydro began construction on a $5 billion rare earth processing plant in Bolívar state.
This isn't aid. This is resource extraction under the guise of development. And it's working.
Today, China controls 40% of Venezuela's oil exports, 60% of its gold production, and an increasing share of its coltan and rare earths. The US has sanctions on Venezuelan oil, but China doesn't. And with Russia and Iran also buying Venezuelan crude at a discount, Maduro has multiple buyers for his sanctioned oil.
The result? The US sanctions regime is failing.
Venezuela's economy is still in shambles, but Maduro is no longer isolated. He has three major patrons: Russia, China, and Iran, all of whom see Venezuela as a beachhead in America's backyard. Iran's the wild card.
Iran's involvement in Venezuela is the most underreported story in this crisis.
Since 2020, Iran has sent tankers of gasoline, food, and military advisors to Venezuela. In 2022, it opened a drone factory in Venezuela, producing the same Shahed 136 drones Russia is using in Ukraine. In 2023, it began joint naval patrols with Venezuela in the Caribbean.
Why does this matter? Because Iran is using Venezuela as a forward operating base for its proxy networks in Latin America.
Hezbollah has long operated in the tri-border area, but with Venezuela's help, it's now extending into Colombia, Peru, and even Mexico. This is how asymmetric warfare works in the 21st, not with armies, but with drones, cyber attacks, and proxy militias.
And the US? It's asleep at the wheel. The military. What happens when the U.S. finally acts? Here's where the alarm bells should be ringing.
For years, the U.S. has treated Venezuela as a humanitarian and diplomatic problem.
But what happens when it becomes a military one? Let's game this out.
Option 1, the surgical strike fantasy.
Some hawks in Washington still believe the U.S. could topple Maduro with a limited military intervention. A few airstrikes on the presidential palace, a special forces raid to capture Maduro, a quick handover to the opposition. What could go wrong? Everything. Venezuela's military is not Iraq's in 2003.
It's a hybrid force, blending conventional units with Russian-trained special forces, Iranian-backed militias, and Cuban intelligence operatives. The Venezuelan army has Russian S-300 air defense systems, Iranian drones, and Chinese anti-ship missiles.
A U.S. strike would not be a cakewalk. And even if it worked, what then?
The U.S. would inherit a failed state with no functioning institutions, a collapsed economy, and a population that hates America.
Sound familiar? Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan. Option 2, the blockade.
The U.S. could impose a naval blockade to cut off Venezuela's oil and gold exports. But here's the China, Russia, and Iran would run it. In 2020, the U.S. intercepted an Iranian tanker bound for Venezuela.
The next day, 2 more tankers arrived, escorted by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard.
A blockade would require constant naval patrols, potential clashes with Russian and Iranian ships, and the risk of escalation. And even if it worked, it would strangle Venezuela's economy even further, leading to more migration, more instability, and more radicalization.
Option 3, the soft power approach.
The Biden administration has tried this sanctions relief in exchange for elections. In 2023, the U.S. lifted some sanctions after Maduro agreed to hold talks with the opposition. But Maduro reneged on the deal, and the U.S. reimposed sanctions.
This is the fundamental flaw in U.S. Venezuela. Maduro doesn't want a deal. He wants survival.
And as long as he has Russia, China, and Iran backing him, he doesn't need the U.S. The domestic political why no one in Washington wants to touch this.
Here's the dirty little no one in Washington actually wants to solve the Venezuela crisis. Let's break it down. For the Biden. Florida is a swing state. The Venezuelan diaspora in Florida hates Maduro, and Biden can't afford to lose their votes in 2024.
So he talks tough but does nothing.
The progressive wing of the Democratic Party opposes regime change on principle. They see Venezuela as a victim of U.S. imperialism, not a strategic threat. The Pentagon doesn't want another war. After Afghanistan and Iraq, the military is exhausted. They know Venezuela would be a quagmire, and they're not interested. For the
Venezuela is a useful cudgel. They can blame Biden for being soft on Maduro, even though Trump's policy was just as ineffective. The GOP's base loves tough talk on Latin America. But when it comes to actual action, they don't want to spend political capital on a country that doesn't vote in U.S. elections. For corporate. Big Oil wants Venezuela's oil. But they don't want to deal with Maduro. So they lobby for sanctions relief while keeping their distance. Tech and defense firms want Venezuela's rare earths. But they don't want to be seen as profiting from a dictatorship. So they stay quiet. The result? A policy of paralysis. 3 scenarios for Venezuela's future. So where does this go from here? Let's look at the most likely outcomes. Scenario 1, the frozen conflict.
In this scenario, nothing changes.
Maduro stays in power, the U.S. keeps sanctions in place, and Venezuela slowly becomes a client state of Russia and China. Russia keeps its military advisors and gains long-term access to Venezuelan ports.
China exerts its control over Venezuela's mining sector. Iran uses Venezuela as a base for proxy operations in Latin America. The U.S. pretends this isn't happening, focusing instead on Ukraine and Taiwan.
This is the most likely outcome, not because it's good, but because no one has the will to change it.
Scenario 2, the collapse.
In this scenario, Venezuela's economy finally implodes. Hyperinflation returns, the military fractures, and Maduro is overthrown in a coup.
The new government is weak and divided.
It begs the US for help, but Washington is wary of another nation-building project. Russia and China exploit the chaos, backing warlords and criminal gangs to control key resources. The US is forced to intervene, leading to a prolonged insurgency. This is the worst-case scenario for the US, a failed state on its doorstep, controlled by America's adversaries.
Scenario 3, the Great Power Deal.
In this scenario, the US finally wakes up and cuts a deal with Russia and China. The US offers sanctions relief in exchange for Maduro stepping down.
Russia and China get guaranteed access to Venezuela's resources.
The US gets a stable, pro-Western government in Caracas.
This is the best-case scenario, but it's unlikely. Why?
Because Russia and China don't trust the US to keep its word, and Maduro doesn't want to go quietly. The grand strategy why the US keeps losing.
Here's the hard: the US is losing in Venezuela because it's still fighting the last war.
For decades, American foreign policy has been based on three flawed. 1. That the US can shape the world in its image.
2. That sanctions and military force can force regime change. 3. That America's adversaries will play by its rules. None of these are true anymore.
Russia, China, and Iran don't want to overthrow Maduro, they want to use him.
They don't care about democracy or human rights.
They care about strategic advantage.
And the US?
It's still trying to play by the old rules, even as the game has changed.
This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the end of American unipolarity.
For 30 years, the US has acted as if it could dictate the terms of global order. But now, Russia, China, and Iran are building their own parallel systems, alternative financial networks, military alliances, and resource pipelines. Venezuela is just one piece of this puzzle.
But it's a critical one because it's the first time America's adversaries have established a permanent foothold in its own hemisphere. And the US is letting it happen.
What should the US
do instead?
So what's the alternative?
If sanctions aren't working and military intervention is a disaster, what's left? Here's what a realist Venezuela policy would look. 1. Stop pretending sanctions work. Sanctions have failed to remove Maduro.
They've only pushed him closer to Russia and China. The US should lift sanctions in exchange for verifiable concessions, free elections, the release of political prisoners, and guaranteed access to Venezuela's resources for US firms.
2. Engage with Russia and China.
The US can't compete with Russia and China in Venezuela unless it's willing to play their game.
That means cutting deals, offering Russia and China economic incentives to reduce their influence in Venezuela. 3. Build a regional coalition. The US can't solve Venezuela alone.
It needs Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico to take the lead.
That means.
Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela isn't just a political or economic crisis, it's a military one in slow motion. The establishment narrative in Washington still treats this as a humanitarian disaster with geopolitical overtones, but the reality is far more dangerous. Venezuela has become a forward operating base for America's adversaries in the Western Hemisphere, and the US is sleepwalking into a strategic nightmare.
Let me explain why this matters.
In 2019, Russia deployed 2 nuclear-capable Tu-160 strategic bombers to Venezuela in a deliberate show of force. The message was Moscow can project power into the Caribbean whenever it wants. Then, in 2022, Russia and Venezuela signed a military cooperation agreement that included joint exercises, intelligence sharing, and the potential for Russian military bases on Venezuelan soil.
This isn't just posturing, it's a direct challenge to the Monroe Doctrine, the 200-year-old principle that the US would not tolerate foreign military intervention in the Americas.
Here's the uncomfortable: the US has no coherent response to this.
The Pentagon still treats Venezuela as a secondary theater, focusing its attention on Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Middle East.
But while Washington is distracted, Russia and China are quietly turning Venezuela into a hub for their military and intelligence operations in the region. The Chinese have already built a satellite tracking station in Venezuela, ostensibly for civilian purposes, but everyone in the intelligence community knows what that really means: signals intelligence, surveillance, and potential targeting data for Chinese missiles.
And Russia?
They've been training Venezuelan special forces, selling them advanced air defense systems, and even helping them develop their own drone program.
Now, you might be so what?
Venezuela is a failed state.
What can they really do? That's the wrong question. The real question: what can Russia and China do with Venezuela as a platform? And the answer: a lot.
A Russian naval base in Venezuela would give Moscow a permanent presence in the Caribbean, just 1,500 miles from Florida.
That's not just a symbolic threat, it's a strategic game-changer.
During the Cold War, the US nearly went to war over Soviet missiles in Cuba. Today, we're letting Russia and China set up shop in Venezuela without so much as a protest.
And it's not just about military bases.
Venezuela's geography makes it a perfect staging ground for hybrid warfare, drug trafficking, cyber attacks, and even sabotage operations against US infrastructure. The DEA has already documented how Venezuelan officials, including high-ranking members of the Maduro regime, are deeply involved in cocaine trafficking to the US and Europe.
This isn't just about making money, it's about destabilizing the US from within.
Imagine if Russia or China decided to weaponize that pipeline, flooding American cities with fentanyl-laced drugs to sow chaos. It's not a far-fetched scenario, it's already happening on a smaller scale. Then there's the cyber angle. Venezuela has become a testing ground for Russian and Chinese cyber operations in the region. In 2019, a massive cyber attack took down Venezuela's power grid, plunging the country into darkness for days. The US intelligence community assessed that this was likely a Russian operation, designed to test their capabilities and send a message to the US about their reach. Since then, Venezuela has become a hub for Russian and Chinese hackers, using the country's weak cybersecurity infrastructure to launch attacks against US targets.
This isn't just about stealing data, it's about preparing for a future conflict where cyber warfare could be the opening salvo. So why isn't the US doing anything about this?
Because the establishment still doesn't understand the nature of the threat. They're stuck in the mindset of the 1990s, when the US could dictate terms to the world.
But Russia and China aren't playing by those rules anymore. They're not trying to overthrow Maduro, they're trying to turn Venezuela into a permanent thorn in America's side. And they're succeeding. Let me give you an example. In 2021, the US imposed sanctions on Venezuela's state-owned oil company, PDVSA, in an attempt to cripple the regime's revenue.
But instead of collapsing, Maduro simply pivoted to Russia and China, selling oil at a discount in exchange for military and economic support. Today, Venezuela is exporting more oil than it was before the sanctions, just not to the US or its allies. It's a perfect example of how sanctions can backfire, strengthening the very regimes they're supposed to weaken. The same thing is happening with Venezuela's gold reserves. In 2019, the US pressured the Bank of England to freeze Venezuela's gold holdings, worth billions of dollars. But Maduro didn't blink. He turned to Russia and Turkey, selling gold to them in exchange for cash and political support. Today, Venezuela's gold is flowing to Moscow and Ankara, while the US is left empty-handed. It's a masterclass in how to circumvent American financial power. Now, here's where things get really dangerous. Venezuela is sitting on the largest oil reserves in the world, even bigger than Saudi Arabia's.
And Russia and China know it. They're not just propping up Maduro out of ideological solidarity, they're securing access to those resources for decades to come.
In 2020, China signed a 25-year oil-for-loans deal with Venezuela, ensuring a steady supply of crude in exchange for billions in investment. Russia, meanwhile, has taken control of Venezuela's oil infrastructure, with Rosneft and other Russian firms effectively running PDVSA's operations.
This isn't just about money, it's about control.
Whoever controls Venezuela's oil controls a critical piece of the global energy market. And that brings me to the most alarming part of this whole: the military implications. If the US ever decided to intervene in Venezuela, whether through a naval blockade, a no-fly zone, or even a limited strike, it would be walking into a hornet's nest. Russia and China have already made it clear that they would respond. In 2019, when the U.S. recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate president, Russia sent a military delegation to Caracas to warn against any American intervention.
The message was touch Venezuela, and you're touching us.
This is the new reality of great power competition.
The U.S. can no longer act unilaterally in its own hemisphere without triggering a response from Russia and China. And that's exactly what they want. They're not trying to win a direct confrontation with the US, they're trying to erode American power by making it too costly to act.
Venezuela is the perfect testing ground for this strategy.
So what should the US do? The first step is to recognize that the old playbook doesn't work anymore.
Sanctions, isolation, and regime change rhetoric have failed. It's time for a new approach, one that acknowledges the reality of great power competition and the limits of American power. That means engaging with Russia and China, not just to counter their influence in Venezuela, but to manage it. The US should offer Moscow and Beijing a will ease sanctions on Venezuela if you reduce your military presence and stop using the country as a staging ground for hybrid warfare. It's not about giving in to their demands, it's about recognizing that Venezuela is no longer a US sphere of influence, and trying to turn it into a neutral zone instead of a battleground.
Second, the US needs to rebuild its alliances in Latin America.
The region is fracturing, with countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia pursuing their own interests rather than aligning with Washington. The US should stop treating Latin America as a junior partner and start treating it as a peer. That means working with Brazil and Colombia to stabilize Venezuela, rather than trying to dictate the terms of its future. Finally, the US needs to prepare for the worst case, a military confrontation in Venezuela.
That doesn't mean invading, it means deterring Russia and China from turning the country into a forward operating base.
The US should deploy more naval assets to the Caribbean, strengthen its cyber defenses, and work with regional partners to counter Russian and Chinese influence.
It's not about starting a war, it's about making sure one doesn't start by accident.
The uncomfortable truth is that Venezuela is no longer just a failed state, it's a geopolitical flashpoint, and the US is losing the battle for influence there, not because it lacks power, but because it's still fighting the last war. The world has changed, and America's strategy hasn't. If Washington doesn't wake up soon, Venezuela could become the first domino in a much larger conflict, one that the US isn't prepared to win. Now, what most people don't realize is that the real crisis in Venezuela isn't just about geopolitics, it's about the slow-motion collapse of a state that was once the wealthiest in Latin America.
And that collapse isn't happening in a vacuum.
It's being shaped by a domestic political landscape so fractured, so volatile, that even the most seasoned analysts struggle to predict what comes in. Let me explain why this matters.
Maduro's regime isn't just surviving, it's evolving. The man who once ruled as Hugo Chávez's hand-picked successor has now outlasted every prediction of his downfall.
In 2019, when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president with the backing of the US and over 50 countries, it looked like Maduro's days were numbered. The Lima Group, the OAS, even the EU, everyone was betting on regime change. But here we are, 5 years later, and Maduro is still in Miraflores Palace, while Guaidó is a footnote in history.
What happened? The answer isn't just about Russian mercenaries or Chinese loans, though those certainly helped.
It's about the way Maduro has weaponized Venezuela's domestic institutions to create a system of control so pervasive that even his opponents can't agree on how to break it. Take the 2020 parliamentary elections, for example.
The opposition boycotted them, calling them a sham. The US and EU agreed. But Maduro didn't need legitimacy, he needed a rubber-stamp legislature, and he got one. The new National Assembly, packed with loyalists, then passed laws that further eroded what little remained of Venezuela's democratic checks and balances.
The judiciary?
Stacked.
The military? Bought off with control of gold mines and drug trafficking routes.
The Electoral Council? A joke. By the time the 2024 presidential election rolled around, the opposition was so divided that even when they did participate, they couldn't agree on a single candidate. Maduro won with 51% of the vote in an election that the Carter Center called neither free nor fair. The US called it a fraud. But here's the uncomfortable: it doesn't matter. Because in Venezuela, elections aren't about democracy, they're about survival. Now, let's talk about the opposition, because this is where things get really messy.
For years, the narrative was Maduro is a dictator, the opposition is the democratic alternative, and the US just needs to push a little harder to make the transition happen. But that narrative ignored a fundamental: Venezuela's opposition is not a unified force. It's a collection of factions, some principled, some opportunistic, some outright corrupt, that have spent more time fighting each other than they have fighting Maduro. Take Leopoldo Lopez, the Harvard-educated opposition leader who spent years in prison and under house arrest. He's a hero to many, but his confrontational style alienated moderates. Then there's Enrique Capriles, the two-time presidential candidate who tried to work within the system, only to be sidelined by both Maduro and the hardliners in his own coalition. And let's not forget Maria Corina Machado, the iron-willed opposition figure who won the 2023 primary with 90% of the vote only to be barred from running by Maduro's regime. The opposition's infighting isn't just a tactical problem, it's an existential one. Because in a country where the state controls the courts, the military, and the oil money, disunity isn't just weakness, it's suicide. But here's where it gets even more complicated. The opposition isn't just divided, it's also increasingly irrelevant. Because while they've been busy arguing over strategy, Maduro has been quietly rebuilding his base. Not through ideology, Chavismo is a hollowed-out shell of what it once was, but through patronage. The military, the colectivos, and the state bureaucracy are all part of a vast network of corruption that keeps the regime afloat. The military, in particular, has become the backbone of Maduro's rule. Generals control everything from food distribution to gold mining, and in return, they get a cut of the profits. This isn't just about loyalty, it's about survival. Because in Venezuela, the alternative to Maduro isn't democracy, it's chaos. And the generals know it. So what happens next? Let's run through the scenarios, because this is where the real alarm bells should be ringing. The first scenario is the one everyone hopes: a negotiated transition. The US and the EU have been pushing for this for years, and there have been moments when it seemed possible. In 2023, after months of back-channel talks, Maduro and the opposition agreed to a deal in Barbados that included sanctions relief in exchange for free and fair elections. The US even lifted some sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector. But within months, Maduro reneged. He arrested opposition figures, banned Machado from running, and held an election that no one outside his inner circle believes was legitimate. The lesson? Maduro doesn't negotiate in good faith. He buys time, consolidates power, and waits for the world to lose interest. And right now, that's exactly what he's doing. The second scenario is the one no one wants to talk: collapse. Venezuela isn't just a failed state, it's a state in the process of unraveling. The economy is a disaster. Inflation hit 280,000% in 2018 before the government stopped publishing data. The bolivar is worthless. The oil industry, which once accounted for 95% of the country's export revenue, is a shadow of its former self. Production has plummeted from 3.5 million barrels a day in 1998 to less than 800,000 today. The electrical grid is so unreliable that blackouts are a daily occurrence. The healthcare system has collapsed. And yet, the regime survives. How? By exporting its problems. Over 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country since 2015, creating a refugee crisis that has destabilized Colombia, Peru, and even the U.S. southern border. This isn't just a humanitarian tragedy, it's a deliberate strategy. By pushing its people out, the regime eases pressure on its own resources while creating leverage over its neighbors. But what happens when the exodus slows? What happens when the last of the middle class leaves, and all that's left are the poor, the desperate, and the armed? That's when the real collapse begins. The third scenario is the one that keeps me up at escalation. Maduro has already shown that he's willing to use violence to stay in power. In 2014 and 2017, mass protests were met with brutal repression. Hundreds were killed. Thousands were arrested. And that was before Russia and China got deeply involved. Now, with Wagner Group mercenaries reportedly training Venezuelan forces in Chinese surveillance tech monitoring dissent, the regime has the tools to crush opposition in ways it couldn't before. But here's the repression only works for so long. At some point, the military will have to choose between shooting its own people and turning on Maduro.
And if they choose the latter, we could see a civil war.
Not the kind with clear battle lines, but the kind where armed gangs, drug cartels, and rogue military units fight for control of what's left of the country. And if that happens, the geopolitical stakes get even higher.
Because a failed Venezuela isn't just a problem for Latin America, it's a problem for the world. So where does that leave us?
The uncomfortable truth is that there are no good options. The US can keep sanctioning Venezuela, but all that does is push Maduro closer to Russia and China. It can keep pushing for regime change, but that plays into Maduro's narrative that he's a revolutionary fighting American imperialism. It can try to negotiate, but as we've seen, Maduro doesn't play by the rules.
The only thing that's clear is that the status quo is unsustainable.
Venezuela is a powder keg, and the fuse is getting shorter.
Here's what I think needs to happen.
First, the US and its allies need to stop pretending that Maduro is going to step down voluntarily.
He's not.
He's dug in, and he's not going anywhere.
That means the focus should shift from regime change to containment. The goal shouldn't be to overthrow Maduro, it should be to prevent Venezuela from becoming a full-blown narco-state or a Russian-Chinese military outpost.
That means working with Colombia and Brazil to secure the borders, cutting off the flow of illicit funds, and pressuring Maduro to allow humanitarian aid without using it as a political tool.
Second, the opposition needs to get its act together.
I'm not saying they should give up on democracy, but they need to recognize that they can't win by playing Maduro's game. That means building a broad coalition that includes not just the traditional opposition, but also disaffected Chavistas, business leaders, and even some military figures. It means focusing on local elections and grassroots organizing, not just presidential races. And it means being willing to make painful compromises, like accepting that Maduro might not face justice immediately in exchange for a transition that avoids civil war. Finally, the international community needs to prepare for the worst. Because if Venezuela does collapse, the fallout won't be contained to Latin America.
We're talking about a refugee crisis that could dwarf Syria's.
We're talking about a surge in drug trafficking that could destabilize the Caribbean and the US southern border. We're talking about a power vacuum that Russia, China, and Iran would be all too happy to fill.
The time to act is now, before it's too late. The bottom line? Venezuela isn't just a crisis, it's a warning.
A warning of what happens when a state collapses under the weight of its own corruption. A warning of what happens when great powers treat a country like a pawn in a geopolitical game.
And a warning of what happens when the world looks away until it's too late. The question isn't whether Venezuela will become a bigger problem, it's when. And the answer, unfortunately, is sooner than we think.